Even though my pack was gone, and my clothing in tatters, I somehow was still in possession of my journal and my excellent Parker duofold. I scribbled some notes in the darkness, more for the purpose of performing a normal human act than scientific necessity, and indeed felt even more of my own self returning to me. Sir William's descent. I still recall the crack of dynamite echoing across the Troad plains, that first of many detonations that changed my fortunes forever. It was my plan, after all, to reach the deeper layers quickly. I had grown impatient with the measured sifting of soil. My ambition demanded swifter results, and indeed, we found many things, and one thing in particular. A deep, hidden vault that had resisted centuries of tomb robbers before. Inside a sarcophagus, oddly reminiscent of Egypt's first dynasty style, was a jewel-encrusted scarab, unlike anything documented from classical sources. The local workers refused to touch it. A curse, they whispered. I claimed it for myself, scoffing at their superstitions, and never spoke of it again. Since then, the scarab has remained with me always, at times growing cool to the touch and murmuring in a voice just beyond my hearing. Even now, I can feel it against my chest, a faint chill emanating as though aware of my every thought. If it is truly Egyptian, it predates any dynastic style I know. Perhaps it is from an age older than the pyramids, a relic of an elder pantheon. Needless to say, it has altered my understanding of the world. I now accept that there are things and powers beyond our understanding. Our current understanding, that is, as all things eventually can and will be measured and explained by modern science. 3 times now, I have ventured to Exham Priory. The first visit was a mere investigation decades past. Surveys of the vaults, interviews with the inbred locals, and so forth. That was long before the recent restoration and swift downfall of the manor, as well as the tragic and unfortunate commitment of the last de la Poire. Upon this, my final return to this god-forsaken area, I had hoped to gain entrance to that wondrous cave world we discovered once again. But the entire estate had been razed beyond what I expected. Indeed, the villagers seemed to have done it with incredible fervor, leaving only a rubble of heavy blocks. My excavation attempts went nowhere. Still, the pull remained. I felt called here both by my own will and by the scarab. I dreamed of wide tunnels spiraling beneath the earth, opening up to vistas where as yet unknown elder architecture was revealed in its sinister glory. The scarab would grow frosty on my skin at these times, as if encouraging me. "Return, deeper," the voice whispered in my dreams. On the second night, I left my modest lodging at a widow's run-down house on the outskirts of Anchester and arrived to find the ruin as desolate as before, every vestige of the old foundation battered by wind and storm. I cursed under my breath at the ineffectiveness of my pickaxe. How was I to unearth anything with the priory so thoroughly obliterated? My hopes, I confess, were dim, but that very night I saw him, a figure wandering the dark grounds, barefoot and aimless, as though trapped in a dream. At first I wondered if it was some vagrant or local drunk. I observed something unnatural in his movements. He paused frequently, as if sniffing the air, and eventually headed straight toward the cliffs. Despite the gloom, I recognized a slack-jawed vacancy in his features. He moved like a man enthralled. I could not believe this was mere coincidence, so I followed from a discreet distance, pickaxe in hand. the moonlight revealed tumbled stones, black timbers rotting in the grass, and somewhere, the constant scuttling of rats. The fellow crossed a precarious ledge overlooking the vast, desolate valley. It was only when he stumbled and turned slightly that I caught sight of his face. A young man's face, pale and with the eyes half-lidded in trance. My heart quickened as he vanished behind some ivy near the high ledge, apparently venturing downward on some unseen path on the meandering limestone cliff. He seemed to know exactly where to go. By the time I scrambled along, indeed finding a dubious path leading down the cliff, he was gone. I remembered the sunbeams coming from high above in that twilit cave our ill-fated party visited, and felt certain this path would lead to one such entry. I dared not go unprepared in the dark, however. Instead, I returned the next morning, clearing foliage and debris and using a rope to secure me during the climb down the narrow crack. Path was too kind a word, for the way was insanely steep and dangerous. Finally, I found a small fissure in the cliffside, which I was able to crawl through. There was still plenty of light illuminating the vast cave from many similar gaps when I reached the inside, and as I stood, I marveled at the grotto's hugeness, and from my elevated position, I directly saw several points worthy of further exploration. Narrow steps had been carved from the rock by some ancient hand, and allowed me to reach the cave floor after a long and careful descent. Nearby, I found the sleepwalker, presumably a villager from Manchester, at his final destination. It was a ghastly scene, even if such things didn't bother me much after my time as an officer in the Great War. The young man must have fallen from the steps I just traversed, for his bones were badly broken in several places. Apparently, he survived the fall, having left a trail of blood several 100 feet long before stopping at this location. But his bad luck hadn't ended there for most of his face, and indeed body had been eaten by what I suspected was a horde of rats. I must admit I felt a tinge of unease, not wishing to share this unsavory fate, but at the same time I felt the calming influence of the scarab. It would not have drawn me here just to be rat food. I was now ready to start a more thorough exploration of this grotto, and I came well prepared. My pack contained water and food, a small tent, and several tools of my trade. Also, I had brought extra batteries for my electric lantern. I made some initial notes in my journal and set off toward a dilapidated building I had not previously seen. I do not remember much of the following days or even weeks I spent in the enormous grotto, and possibly several of its adjacent chambers. I think I gradually fell under a feverish combination of the dreamlike trance the villager had been in, and some dark influence similar to that which had so twisted the de la Poyers. I know not what I ate when my small supply of food ran out, but I remember the constant squeaking of rats, a noxious, writhing undertone. At length, as the days passed, I felt an urge or a call coming from the pitch-black nether regions of the cave system, where our party of 7 had not dared to go. As eventually, I ventured there walking and crawling into the unknowable depths. With the sound of rats about me, I slowly felt the return of my intellect and own will. Even though my pack was gone and my clothing in tatters, I somehow was still in possession of my journal and my excellent Parker duofold. I scribbled some notes in the darkness, more for the purpose of performing a normal human act than scientific necessity, and indeed felt even more of my own self returning to me. Then I stood up and walked like a man into the eerie dusk of what I felt was close to where I would finally meet my fate. For the whispers and beckoning had grown louder and felt much closer. On the sides of the wide tunnel I followed, I became vaguely aware of gargantuan pillars etched with slender hieroglyphs, of a type unknown to me, by themselves marvels worthy of years of analysis. I wondered how my eyes could even make out anything in the prehistoric night that surrounded me. They must have been accustomed to the darkness at a level beyond what was normal. Or was the scarab somehow granting me this vestige of vision? The tunnel opened into another grand cavern, its ceiling far above. A black pit yawned to one side, descending further into unimaginable depths. Ahead I could vaguely make out some kind of huge structure, but was uncertain if it was natural or maybe constructed by the same builders that made those pillars. Then it happened so quickly. A scuttling mass erupted from the shadows. Rats by the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, poured forth in a living wave from the deep pit. I staggered back, fumbling for any weapon, but they paid me no heed. Indeed, the rats seemed to circle wide around me, as if repelled by some invisible boundary. Instinctively, I grabbed the scarab and felt it icy cold in my hand. Whether it projected a barrier or simply exuded an aura that the rats loathed, I cannot say. The rats circled around me for a few long moments more, and then they were gone as quickly as they appeared, returned into that pit, which I felt must be close to the center of the world. I stood shaking. My rational mind screamed to flee, yet the scarab pulsed and urged me along. I felt an unholy craving to proceed, not down this time mercifully, but toward the as yet obscure structure ahead. As I approached, I saw that the structure was indeed mostly natural. A cluster of huge stalactites and stalagmites that met and seemed to have melded into a circle of stone surrounding an empty hole. The rock bore carvings older than any Saxon or Roman influence, depicting twisted forms with elongated limbs, crowned by bestial heads. As I approached, the air changed, growing thick and oppressive. Flickers of weak, phosphorescent fungus cast a ghastly greenish glow. I glimpsed antechambers half filled with water, bone-littered alcoves, and the remnants of altars encrusted with what might have been centuries of dried gore. Amidst some fear, I could not deny my excitement. This was the discovery I had pursued since the Troad, an ancient labyrinth of monstrous design, possibly linked to that same elder pantheon that my scarab represented. As I stood beneath and in front of the circular hole made by the stone, I noticed a rough stairway, cut out of the black stone, leading up to it. Then the rats appeared again, streaming out of their infernal pit with enormous speed and even greater numbers. This time they didn't circle me, but instead the different streams assembled at a certain point close to me, and to my horror, a shape started to emerge from the mass of writhing rats, coalescing into a single towering form. Awestruck, I saw how a head of vast proportions formed before me, a head made by the armies of crawling vermin working in unfathomable concert. I dropped to my knees, not from reverence, but from a sudden crushing weight of terror. The scarab pressed cold reassurance into my chest, as if urging me to submit. My mind reeled with half-formed revelations. The one who manipulates mortal ambition, Nyarlathotep. But whether the name was truly his, or merely one of 1,000 masks, I cannot say. Slowly I raised my eyes. The head remained rattling with the squeaks of countless rats. Its pit-like eyes regarded me in silence. I felt my lips move soundlessly in some archaic chant. My body was no longer my own. I was a vessel for the scarab's will and the greater presence that guided it. A hiss of breath, or was it laughter, mocking laughter, escaped that unseen mouth. In that moment I knew that every choice, every grave I dynamited at the Troad, every obscure expedition, had been orchestrated by this creature, this god, this cosmic puppet master. I bowed my head, pressing my forehead to the slimy floor in abject surrender. I felt the head suddenly collapse, becoming multitudes of rats again, running around at whirling speed. When finally I dared to look up again, I gasped. The circular void surrounded by the stalactites and stalagmites was no more. Instead, what seemed like an immense artwork of the most lifelike quality was in its place. The rats were flooding up the stairway and seemingly jumping into this painting, and I assumed falling to their deaths on the stones below. But it soon dawned on me, as I saw movement and felt the fresh air from the twilit desert landscape shone, that this was no artwork of any form. This was a sorcerous gate leading to an unknown place. Cautiously, when the last of the rats were piling out, I moved up the stony stairs and stopped before the scene, regarding it intently. I gasped as I saw in the distance the foundations of a huge pyramid, being in a half-finished state. Beneath it was a sea of tents and fires, and many sounds were borne in on the wind. I hesitated no further, but walked through the gate, and felt the warm night air envelop me, and the sudden joy of being outside. I found myself on the desert sands. Behind me no trace of the gate, or indeed of Britain, was seen. Whatever this was, it was the will of my new god, and I would obey. Greatness was sure to lay ahead,